Good to be with you all this morning. Last week we started talking about the biblical concept of modesty, a subject that the Bible does address in a number of places, and that is very often mistreated or ignored by even people claiming to be Christians, people claiming who they are concerned with following and obeying God faithfully. We did 2 lessons on this last week. In the morning, we looked at really everything about modesty aside from clothing. That is something that is missed sometimes. That modesty is first described as something of the heart. It is an attitude. It is a way that we carry ourselves. It is a way we go out into the world and present ourselves to people. And it is about being respectable, about not drawing undue attention to ourselves or generally making a fool of ourselves or bringing shame upon ourselves in various ways. And so modesty of the heart is extremely important, and you can be clothed from head to toe and still miss that aspect of modesty to your detriment. Then last week in the evening lesson, we looked at clothing more carefully because modesty is also about clothing. There are some preachers in some churches that do a good job of preaching the first lesson, that modesty of the heart part, but then will not make any particular application to clothing. They will just vaguely say, well, be careful, do your best, or make sure that your heart is right, and that's more important than the actual clothes you are wearing. And we described last week that this does not go far enough, that the Bible goes further than that. The Bible gives definitions and limits for what we ought to wear. A portion of that is how much of the body is covered. And we went all the way back to God's creation order, which means this is something that goes beyond any one covenant, something central to how God made us, that when Adam and Eve created clothes for themselves, they were insufficient clothes. Even though they had minimal coverage and covered the parts that Adam and Eve deemed suitable to cover, God said that was not enough, and he made them what are described as tunics, which is something we have a definition for. So we know that the body must be covered from shoulders to knees, that the Bible routinely talks about exposure as something shameful, that we are not to be out in public and out among the general populace with our bodies exposed in this way. We also talked about another element of modesty that is given attention, especially in the New Testament, but in the Old Testament as well, that overdressing and drawing attention to ourselves through our clothing, through being exceptionally flashy, showy, but this is also immodest, that it is not respectable for us to try to use very expensive clothing or accessories to assume that we will get better attention or to put ourselves up above other people, that God expects us to be respectable and to realize that clothing communicates something, but it's not meant to bring the spotlight onto me. Well, we have more we want to talk about with this. If you didn't get a chance to hear those lessons, I'd really encourage you to listen to the recordings of them. We have them available on CD or on our website. They're on our YouTube page as well. Brian live streamed those, and so they're on Facebook. If you're on his Facebook page, you can have access to be able to listen to them. And they're important information that set up this lesson and the lesson that we will cover next week as well. So I'd encourage you to make sure that you hear those lessons. What we're talking about here today is modesty and cultural norms, cultural considerations around clothing. And this is an important subject because sometimes people say, well, modesty is purely a cultural phenomenon. Do whatever people around you say is modest. And we can reject that very quickly because when does God ever tell us, just do what everyone around you is doing? That is not the standard for Christians in any area of life. Yet there is a piece of modesty, if we're talking about being respectable and not drawing undue attention to ourselves, there is a piece of modesty that is cultural, and we'll show that in this lesson. Let's first describe the idea that clothing communicates something. We've kind of assumed this through our lessons so far, but communication is important, and obviously we communicate to each other through our words, but more important than our words is everything that accompanies them. The same words with a different tone of voice or different delivery or different volume, different facial expressions, gestures, body language can create a very different meaning. And our clothing is also a part of this. Before I've ever spoken a word to you, I have communicated something to you if you can see the way that I'm presenting myself to you. And that would go for my clothing, for my grooming, for the way that I am displaying myself to you. Your perception of me changes based on how I present myself. A few biblical examples of this that we'll look at quickly with clothing. Genesis chapter 37, verses 2 through 4. Genesis 37, verses 2 through 4. These are generations of Jacob. Joseph, being 17 years old, was pasturing the flock with his brothers. He was the boy with the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, his father's wives, and Joseph brought a bad report of them to their father. Now Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons because he was the son of his old age, and he made him a robe of many colors. But when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peacefully to him. Joseph wore a garment, a robe or coat, yours might say, of many colors that could represent a lot of things in a lot of different contexts, but in this context, it represented to Joseph his father's favor. And to Joseph's brothers, it represented that Joseph was held above the rest of them. And so every time they saw him wearing that garment, they knew exactly what it meant. That clothing communicated something. Well, just later on in this chapter, down in verse 34, after Joseph's brothers sold Joseph into slavery, lied about it to their father, told him that he had been killed, that he had been torn apart by wild animals, Jacob, verse 34, tore his garments and put sackcloth on his loins and mourned for his son many days. The sackcloth that Jacob wore expressed something. It was an indication of mourning. Even if you had no idea what had happened, if you came across Jacob in that condition, you would know something terrible had happened and that he was mourning. In John chapter 19, verses 2 through 5, John chapter 19, verses 2 through 5. This is when Jesus is being delivered up to be crucified. It says, and the soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head and arrayed him in a purple robe. They came up to him saying, Hail, King of the Jews, and struck him with their hands. Pilate went out again and said to them, See, I am bringing him out to you so that you may know that I find no guilt in him. So Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. Now, obviously, they're doing this mockingly here, but the only reason the mockery works is because that purple robe represents something. They put Jesus in a royal robe meant to indicate that he's a king, and They do this for the contrast of, look at this royal king that we're going to kill upon a cross. But if clothing didn't communicate anything, then that would be meaningless, wouldn't it? They knew exactly what that meant, and that was the effect that they were trying to get across. And then there's a passage that we looked at last week in Proverbs chapter 7 and verse 10. Proverbs chapter 7 and verse 10, that Solomon is warning his sons about the immoral woman, the adulteress. He says, and behold, the woman meets him dressed as a prostitute, wily of heart. So this is dressed as a prostitute. Your translation might say with the attire of a harlot. And we asked last week, what is the dress of a prostitute, the attire of a harlot? Is it a name tag that says, hello, I am a prostitute? No, you know exactly what that is. That is revealing and provocative, seductive, meant to display something. And it is obvious when she portrays herself that way, what message she is trying to get across. So those are just a few biblical examples of how clothing could communicate something. We can think of a few cultural examples as well. We have some very explicit kind of communication through clothing. Consider uniforms. The military, the police, medical professionals, and people in other jobs wear a uniform that communicates who they are and what they do. Especially for something like the military, you think about how it's not just the uniform, but the badges, the insignia, these kinds of things all communicate information to you. If you know all of the symbols and what they mean, then you can know who this individual is, what rank he is, what part of the military he is in, so on and so forth. Same with law enforcement. Medical professionals can display a uniform. And consider how absurd it would be if somebody wore a uniform that didn't match who they were. If I came in here today and I was wearing full military uniform for United States Marines, I didn't serve in the Marines. Would that be inappropriate? Would that be very strange for me to do such a thing? You would all have many questions for me and wonder, or it not even have to be here, in any setting, if you saw me wearing that would be highly inappropriate. If I were dressed as a police officer, then I am either wearing a costume, in which we better hope it's Halloween, or at a costume party, or I'm being very eccentric, which is not wonderful, or I'm trying to deceive you about who I am. And that might even be fraudulent and criminal for me to do such a thing. That uniform means something. And that's obvious to us. You don't even really have to put a lot of thought into it to understand that. Our clothing can explicitly communicate things through certain symbols, logos, and text. So if I wear a shirt or a hat with particular text on it, it might indicate that I am a supporter of this politician. And you know that just by looking at the hat that I'm wearing. If I wear a jersey from my favorite sports team that's got my favorite player's name on it, you know what that means. In that case, the cultural communication is not that Danny is trying to pass himself off as this professional athlete. You know that. Because culturally, if I wear the jersey of my favorite player, I'm saying I'm a fan of this team and I'm a fan of this player. And so you understand exactly what that means. That's different than the uniform. If I wear a shirt with the name of a local business on it, you might conclude that I'm a regular patron of that business. that I enjoy going there and that I want to show my fandom of them or my enjoyment of them and maybe help advertise for them. Of course, there are symbols that can communicate things, even that can communicate a hateful ideology. So if I wear clothing that has a swastika on it, what does that communicate to you? It is a hateful ideology and not something that I should want to portray. So clothing in these cases with uniforms and symbols and logos and text, that's all very explicit communication, designed for that purpose and very obvious to everyone. But there are many other less obvious examples as well. Just the way that I choose to dress, how much I am covering, how formal that clothing is, no matter what I choose to wear. I guarantee you I'm communicating something to you. That is just the nature of clothing. Well, now let's think about cultural norms and taboos. Remember that the modesty principle that we defined last week is not just about covering the appropriate amount of skin, although that is a part of it. It is also about being respectable or well-ordered. And so we need to consider what messages our clothing portray to people to know if that's respectable or not. And there is a piece of this that is defined culturally. For example, look at 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 3. This is a passage that has confused some people, that they have wondered exactly what to make of it. In 1 Peter 3 and verse 3, we read this last week. We'll read it again here. In talking to these women, it says, "Do not let your adorning be external, the braiding of hair or the putting on of gold jewelry or the clothing you wear." Then it goes on to describe the good spirit and the good works that they should have instead. But this prohibition against braided hair seems very strange to us. Why would a woman be prohibited from braiding her hair? And some have concluded, well, maybe there's something inherently sinful about this. And I need to make sure that whatever hairstyle I choose, it is not braided in any way. And they've missed the point there. The examples that he gives here help clue us into what kinds of things he's talking about. He says braided hair, gold jewelry, and the clothing you wear. Obviously, he can't be making a blanket condemnation against all these things, because then, just by a strictly literal reading, clothing would be sinful. That would take this modesty series down a very different path that we're not going to go down. And that's not what Peter is saying. Clearly, he's talking about some kind of abuse or excess. That it's not that you're wearing clothing, it's that the clothing you choose to wear is a problem. It's not that you have gold jewelry, it's that the flashy, gaudy jewelry that you display to others is a problem. And it's not necessarily that your hair is braided, but there's some cultural piece here that we're missing. See, this one's harder for us to fill in the blank for because we don't have a cultural connection to this. You would never look at a woman today with braided hair and think, look at this scandalously immodest thing that she is doing. But when Peter was writing this by inspiration of the Holy Spirit, he was referring to something that was commonplace in that day. The braiding of the hair was part of an elaborate hairstyle that took significant time to shape and style. And it wasn't just about arranging the hair in some elaborate way. They would weave gold and silver into their hair as part of the style. It was meant to portray extravagant wealth and beauty. Fits in with these other examples. The very gaudy jewelry, the very expensive, flashy clothing, now the hairstyle, that has taken many hours to arrange and has all this gold and silver woven into it. Peter's talking about something that is extravagant and over the top. And so there's a cultural piece there that made sense to them that now we don't have that kind of hairstyle today. But if we did, then we could apply that same idea to it. Yet we can take the same principle and consider the designer labels or the very flashy handbags, purses that some women have, that the whole goal of that accessory is to display the expensive brand name as prominently as possible. Or the people who get the fake Rolex watches that have no quality to them at all, but it's got the right logo on it, and I want to show that logo. Or if you move beyond clothing just for a moment, the person who buys a base trim model of a car and goes and gets the badges for the expensive trim and puts all those badges on that car, saying, look at how expensive and fast and luxurious my car is, even when it is nothing of the sort. All of these are examples of an immodest spirit, an immodest portrayal that we are giving to others. So that's an example of a cultural norm that needed to be addressed in Bible times. Every culture has explicit and implicit norms and taboos. By norms, we mean things that are accepted and expected. By taboos, we mean things that are looked down upon or that are not acceptable in the culture. And so if we are going to be respectable, modest people who are well-ordered, we need to try to fall in line with those cultural expectations whenever we can do so without sin. That's always the caveat when we're talking about culture, because culture goes wildly far afield sometimes. And so it's not going to be the entirety of our standard. But when culture does present something as an expectation that's not a sin, then it's good for us to fall in line. Think about some more examples of this. Every culture has some clothing that is portrayed as masculine or feminine. And the Bible even talks about this gendered clothing and how it is sinful. It is unacceptable to mix those up. A man is not to wear women's clothing and a woman is not to wear men's clothing. You're not supposed to portray yourself as the other gender when that's not what you are. In Deuteronomy 22 and verse 5, it said, a woman shall not wear a man's garment, nor shall a man put on a woman's cloak, for whoever does these things is an abomination to the Lord your God. Now, that idea is simple. This is not hard to understand. Men don't need to be women, and women don't need to be men. When we start considering clothing, there are some examples that are very obvious to us. Things that if you saw a man wearing, you would raise an eyebrow and go, why are you wearing that? That is woman's clothing, or vice versa. But every culture also has some things that are considered more unisex clothing as well. And sometimes the lines can be a little bit fuzzy there, can be a little bit difficult. Sometimes the solution to this is there are small variations and small alterations made to indicate whether this is for a man or for a woman. But some things are worn alike. What clothing goes with what gender? Largely, this is controlled culturally. For example, if a man wears a skirt here in America, that is viewed as effeminate. Fortunately, our culture is moving a direction where we say that an effeminate man is a good thing, that a man who wants to wear women's clothing is bold and daring and should be accepted. that's its own problem. But we understand in our culture, our presentation of this, that a skirt is considered to be feminine, and so putting that on a man is effeminate. Yet in Scotland, when a man wears a kilt, which functionally is a skirt, it doesn't have that same cultural communication. That same garment communicates something different in that culture. Now, I don't wear a kilt because I'm not from that culture or in that culture, and it would be strange for me to do so. But in that culture, that could be communicated and could be acceptable. In ancient Rome, they had the toga. The toga was a loose, flowing garment, and it was decidedly masculine. Only a man wore a toga. But if I wore a toga today, very loose and flowing like this, that would probably read as feminine to our culture. And in fact, every so often you see that some fashion designer tries to make a garment based off of the toga, and almost always it is directed at women. It is meant to be a feminine article of clothing. That would be insane in the ancient Roman context, but makes sense with our cultural context. So even when we consider things like gendered clothing, we have to pay attention to some degree with how culture frames that. There's also clothing for certain culturally important events. Generally speaking, American weddings, most Western weddings, feature a bride in a white dress. Now, if you were a bride, you didn't wear a white dress, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. You can make your wedding, whatever you want it to be. We're talking about the general cultural trends here. Usually in Western weddings, the bride wears a white dress. And what goes along with that is that if you are a guest at a wedding, it is absolutely taboo for you to show up in a white dress. You're upstaging the bride. Now, any other day of the year and any other setting, if you wear a white dress, nobody's going to look twice. But when you, as a guest to a wedding, show up and you're wearing a white dress, now suddenly it is very rude. There's a cultural piece there that is important. In fact, very often women try to avoid even wearing something that is too close to white, just to make sure that they could not possibly be seen as upstaging the bride. So they'll watch out for the lighter silvers and the off-whites and make sure that there's enough distance in color and presentation that the bride is obviously the bride, I am obviously the guest. Yet in a different culture, it works differently. In a Chinese wedding, the bride typically wears a red dress. And so it is very inappropriate and just as rude for you to be the guest at a Chinese wedding and to wear red. And this is something that comes up sometimes when we have cross-cultural weddings, that sometimes these people need to put that information on the invitation saying, hey, we've got a blending of cultures here. Just so you know, you should avoid wearing white and you should avoid wearing red because that's going to be seen as very strange from people from this other culture that are also going to be here. And so sometimes that needs to be explicitly communicated to people to help them not commit a faux pas. So there are different events that require certain kinds of clothing or that require you not to wear a certain kind of clothing. And that's a function of culture. There's also expected level of formality. There might be explicit expectations surrounding this. If you go to school or work, you may have a dress code that you need to follow. Certain things you must wear or certain guidelines for what is appropriate to wear. When I was a bank teller, we had a dress code. what we were supposed to wear a button-down shirt and khaki pants typically. And we had a certain amount of the year that we were allowed to wear jeans on Fridays. And I got that mixed up one time, and I came in jeans when it wasn't a day with jeans, and I got dress coded and sent home from my big boy job at the bank. And that was just one of those things, right? But sometimes we have explicit dress codes. If you have jury duty, your jury duty form, I don't know if we do that here, but everywhere else I've been, they've got a dress code on there saying this is what's appropriate to wear in court. Don't just show up in whatever. But there are also implicit expectations, even if it wasn't written down on anything, even if nobody explicitly told you. There are certain occasions that you understand how formal or informal you need to be. And so if you show up to an interview for an office job and you're wearing shorts and a graphic tee, very likely that's inappropriate. Even though shorts and a graphic tee could be modest, depending on what the graphic is and depending on what the shorts are, I suppose, but that could be modest in another setting. It's not appropriate for the interview. I think every funeral that I have ever preached, there's always been some cousin or some guest that comes to the funeral looking obviously out of place. There's, of course, a range in what people will wear to a funeral. Some people might be very formal, some people maybe a little less so. But then the person who comes in with flip-flops and a ratty t-shirt and their hair is not combed, you just go, this is a funeral. What made you show up like this? Why would you disparage the occasion? But it can go the other way too. If you arrive at a backyard barbecue in a tuxedo and tails, what would you be communicating to people? Like, would they'd say, well, you really think you're something, don't you? You're quite pretentious to think that this is appropriate. That's not the setting for a garment like that. All these things would stand out in an undesirable way. So we consider the cultural norms and taboos even with the expected level of formality for an event. And we also have to remember that cultural norms can change over time. I'll give you an ancient example. We talked about the toga earlier, and I told you that the toga was a decidedly masculine garment. It actually didn't start out that way. In the very early Roman Empire, togas were seen as unisex garments that men and women would both wear. By the end of the Roman Empire, that definition had shifted so much that if you were a woman wearing a toga, you were assumed to be a prostitute or an adulteress. That's just the cultural definition. And there was no one day where that magically shifted, where everyone just agreed this is the way it is now. That's something that changed over time. And of course, now we don't even have togas at all here, so that cultural norm has changed even more for us, that wouldn't be something that's generally appropriate for us to wear without standing out in a strange way. More modern examples in our culture. Just a few decades ago, in our country, if you were a woman wearing pants, you were seen as imitating a man or making some kind of radical political statement. This is really no longer true. Pants are widely accepted as unisex clothing in formal and informal settings in our culture, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. Men's clothing has done it as well. There used to be a very sharp distinction between a men's suit and a men's slacks and sport coat. You ever wonder why it's called a sport coat? because it was something you could wear for everyday activities. And so you would never wear a sport coat to something formal, and you would never wear a suit to something informal, but you could wear that sport coat, which is honestly kind of hard to tell the difference sometimes between a suit coat and a sport coat and exactly which is which, but it really used to matter because, yeah, you could go hunting in your slacks and a sport coat, which would be very strange now, but you wouldn't want to wear your sport coat, no matter how nice it was, to a formal event. Certainly wouldn't show up to church in one, certainly wouldn't go to anywhere important in one. Men had suits they'd wear at work, and then a different suit they'd change into just for being around the house, eating dinner with the family. How many of you men do that today? You change from your work suit to your home suit. That's just not culturally true anymore. You might not even wear a work suit at all. So cultural norms can change. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that to a point, as long as they don't change in a way that violates God's law. So how can we navigate cultural standards? We first need to establish that cultural change can never authorize something that God forbids. This is true beyond clothing. It's true in everything. If everyone in the world agrees that something is right, but God says it is wrong, guess what? It's wrong. That can never be changed. It was true when we talk about worship, with conduct, with the definition of marriage, with divorce. It's true with clothing as well. And we should expect this because the Bible talks about this quite a bit. In Isaiah chapter 5, verses 20 and 21, Isaiah chapter 5, verses 20 and 21 says, "Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness, who put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. Woe to those who are wise in their own eyes and shrewd in their own sight." So it is quite normal for people in the world to swap these definitions, to call good things evil and evil things good, and to think that they're very wise and very smart for doing so. I gave the example of how you have some men today who are proud to wear skirts, proud to wear dresses, specifically because they want to challenge the gender norms. They want to show that a real man can look like a woman, or a real man doesn't have to be a man at all, and then could be a woman. And these things are not appropriate and are not right, no matter how many people agree with them. In Romans chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. Romans chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. "As I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect." The world is generally wrong about a great many things. And so we can't blindly go along with what everyone else is doing. The phrasing here of being holy and acceptable means that we are different. And that's something that we have to get used to and comfortable with. In 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 14 through 16, First Peter 1, 14 through 16, "As obedient children, do not be conformed to the passions of your former ignorance, but as he who called you is holy, you also be holy in all your conduct, since it is written, you shall be holy, for I am holy." The holiness principle here is connected to God's nature. This is a fundamental misunderstanding that many people have about holiness. Even people in the church, even Bible-believing, God-fearing Christians think that holiness, even they might not explicitly say it this way, but this is the way a lot of people act. Holiness means we need to do better than what the average person is doing. That's not the standard at all. I'm not concerned with what the average person is doing. Being holy means I am being like God. And so, yeah, that will be better than the average person. It might be very dramatically better than the average person. It might be so strange that we are looked at in shock of how can you possibly think that this is the right way to be. We are holy like God is holy. That's what that 1 Peter 4 verse 4 says, that these worldly people may be surprised when you don't join them in their debauchery. So don't expect to look to the world for our understanding of what is right and wrong. As we talk about cultural things in this lesson, I don't want you to come away with the idea that culture rules overall. There is an area of gray where culture can control some things, but the general standard of right and wrong remains the same. Let's think about some examples of clothing that are considered culturally appropriate, yet are sinful. So this is not like the white wedding dress example and how the guest shouldn't wear the white dress. It's not the example of what a good interview attire would be. These are things like revealing swimsuits at the beach or the water park. Culturally, this is not shocking at all. In fact, it's probably more shocking if you go to the beach fully clothed. And they think, what are you doing here? Why would you do this? People dress at the beach in a way that they might not dress anywhere else. They say, of course, it's the beach. Water means that we don't have to be concerned with how much skin is covered. Nowhere in the Bible does it say that. Nowhere in the Bible are we authorized to change that standard because there is water nearby. The cultural standard goes farther than this in some places. It's very common in Europe and in some other places to have nude beaches. There was one in San Diego where we lived. You really had to know which beach you were going to there. They had the beaches set up for different purposes. You had the party beach, you had the family beach, you had the nude beach, and you don't want to mix those up. But the nude beach is a common feature in a lot of places. But that doesn't make it right to go around exposed, showing what ought not be shown to others. It is culturally appropriate in many places, including here, to wear certain sports uniforms and athletic attire that do not adequately cover the body. To a lot of people, since you are playing a sport or since you are working out, you don't need to be concerned with what you are covering. If you go to the gym, you are very aware of this. That you have people walking around in next to nothing, as if muscles don't work if they have clothing over them. We've got to just take everything off in order to be able to lift weights. Your muscles still work, even if you have something over them. And certain sports, not every sport is like this, but certain sports, the uniform for them is very revealing. Volleyball is notorious for that, girls volleyball in particular, that you wear something that is covering very, very little. And maybe I wouldn't walk around like this all the time, but it's volleyball. So now the rules are different. Why are the rules different? Nothing in the Bible allows for us to change that standard just because I'm now in a different setting. And remember, the thing that makes this different than the cultural standards we were talking about before is that these violate something that God established. Culture can never go so far as to do that. Weddings are a big one here. wedding dresses, it is so common for wedding dresses to be very revealing. And I find this shocking, actually, that a wedding dress designed to show off parts of the body that are meant for your husband who you are there marrying, but that would be seen as good and appropriate. Why take advantage of that time, which is supposed to be happy and joyous and full of love, to then be provocative and shameful and exposed in a way that is not right? Wedding dresses need to follow the same standard of modesty that any other article of clothing does. There's no exception given here. And so there are some questions that we should ask ourselves when deciding what to wear. First, ask, does it adequately cover what needs to be covered? If not, you need to find something else to wear. You can't go any further than this until you know that that is addressed. Is it suitable for the occasion? Now that we know it covers enough, is it suitable for the occasion? Here's how culture is starting to come into it now, right? That's defined by the culture. But is this suitable for where I am going? For the backyard barbecue or jury duty or the funeral or whatever the case may be. Is it suitable for that occasion? Does it draw unnecessary attention to me? Certain things you wear, even if they're covering enough, you might as well be shining a spotlight on yourself, saying, everyone, look at me. Not really a Christian attitude to have. You try to draw all this attention to yourself. Does it unnecessarily set you apart from your community? Sometimes there's this desire to be so countercultural that I need to be totally different than everyone else in every way. And so I don't want to do anything that anyone else does. The ironic part about that is all the countercultural people seem to do the same things together, and so they just have their own culture that they create. But we need to be careful about that mindset. I don't want to be respectable. I don't want to fit in. There are lots of reasons as Christians why we might not fit in. We don't need to go adding more that are unnecessary. And then we can also ask, does this thing I want to wear, does it hinder my work and hinder my example? Is it going to cause a problem wherever I am? If so, I need to reconsider. One last thing I want to discuss here before we wrap this lesson up, and you've been very patient with it, is to give a special warning about what we do when cultural norms are changing around us. Remember, I described the change in the Roman expectation of a toga, and the change in whether it's acceptable for women to wear pants or not, and the change in many other things that have changed over time. Those are not the only examples. There are things even now that are changing year by year. We want to do what is right and respectable. But the definitions of what are right and respectable change some over time. Again, when it's the biblical standard, we're going to hold firm. Never going to let culture tell me that I can now expose more than should be exposed, or let culture justify being showy and flashy when I should not. Talking about in these other things, in what is appropriate for an interview. Depending on the field you're in, your interview attire may be very different. Depending on where you live, your expected level of formality may be very different. There's a different vibe on the West Coast where we were than there is here. There, almost no one wears a suit for any reason there, no matter what their job is. I think the lawyers barely wear suits there. That's just reality in that culture. Again, these things change and shift slowly over time. And so I want to give you two quick examples of things that are changing right now in our society that we need to navigate carefully. The first one is what I was describing just then, that the level of formality is generally falling. There's a geographical component to this, that it's different on the West Coast than it is here, but all over our country, the expected level of formality in every setting is falling. More jobs are accepting casual clothing. More and more, the very formal attire is beginning to look out of place. Fewer of the nice, fancy restaurants require slacks and jackets. Workplace dress codes relax. Lots of things can change about the expected level of formality. This can be okay, but we need to be careful. Because this also can be a sign of not being willing to treat any occasion with honor, of not taking seriously certain serious occasions and situations that we're in. This is part of a broader cultural phenomenon that everything should be joked about, that everything should be taken lightly, and not considering that there are some positions, some situations, some entities, some institutions, some parts of life that are just serious. So, you can navigate how things are getting more informal, but I want you to try to thread the needle in showing respect when respect is due, without communicating pretense or arrogance, as those standards may continue to change. Another cultural norm that is changing very rapidly as these last couple generations have passed is with that of tattoos. My grandparents' generation were utterly scandalized by tattoos. It was a sign that you could not integrate into polite society. Sure, certainly there are some exceptions, and some people were okay with them even then. But generally speaking, to go get a tattoo means you are going to be countercultural, rebellious, never hold down a reasonable job in your life, never have a good family and house, that you're going to go be some bum or criminal or loser for the rest of your life. That was very much the way they were perceived. My parents' generation viewed tattoos with a certain amount of distrust, but more and more people were beginning to accept them. Much more divided, still scandalized. Some began to embrace them. My generation is very accepting of tattoos. The stat I saw is that 41% of people in my generation have at least one tattoo. That's not very countercultural if 41% of people are doing it. It's just pretty normal behavior at this point. When we look even younger, Gen Z are getting tattoos at an even faster rate. They haven't quite hit the 41%, still younger, but they're working on it. They're getting tattoos just as quickly as they can. They're increasingly viewed as art and personal expression with no intention of rebellion. Again, there are some people who do try to be countercultural with it, who do try to be rebellious with it, but many, many more who are not. There's a joke that I've heard a number of times, and I find it very funny. It says, a tattoo used to mean that you were a biker in a gang willing to kill, and now it means you are a chef who makes a lovely pork belly. And that just goes to show how the cultural lens is different around tattoos. So the warning here is that culture is not a monolith. It changes unevenly. And if you want to consider getting a tattoo, you can look at how things are changing and say, well, there's no stigma around tattoos anymore. You're partially right. But I want you to remember that the culture includes not just your generation. Culture includes all the people who are living now. And the tricky thing about a tattoo is if I compare to something like clothing I can change. If I go into one setting where very formal clothing is required, I can put on that clothing. If I go into a different setting where now I need something informal, I can put that on. But with a tattoo, I have what I have. And if it's a visible tattoo, then I'm kind of stuck with it. Not necessarily a bad thing, but it just means that there is an added challenge if you find yourself in a situation where you are around people who view tattoos with that older mindset. And they're not wrong for having their mindset. It is what was true for them. And so you can be perceived in that way, which is probably not what you're trying to communicate. This is the tricky thing with tattoos. The question of tattoos is easily the most common question I've ever been asked as a preacher. I've had so many people ask, is it okay for me to get a tattoo, or should I get my tattoo removed if I already have one? And what I always tell people is, personally, I'm pretty neutral on tattoos. I don't have any and I don't want any, but I don't really have a stigma against them or a bias against them. But a tattoo is a permanent decision that you make. And it is something that you portray in every situation you are in from here on out. And so the Bible does not forbid tattoos. There's no verse that says you can't get one or that it's evil to do so. And the verse you're thinking about in Leviticus isn't about a tattoo in general. It's about idolatry. So there's no scriptural reason for me to tell you it is forbidden to get a tattoo. What I'm saying is it may be difficult to be modest and respectable in every setting, depending on what tattoo you get and where it is. Think about that. And make that decision carefully, because that cultural norm is very uneven and changing all the time. What we wear is part of our example to the world. So we have to give attention to it. Christians should be people who act, speak, and dress wisely. You need to be careful not to commit sin in your dress by having too much exposed or by not being respectable and appropriate for the situation. Be careful not to sin even if everyone around you is okay with it. Even in those morally neutral matters, strive to be respectable and agreeable in every circumstance. Clothing matters so much for that. Thanks for your attention. I know we've looked at a lot today. There's so much to talk about as we look at modesty, which is why we have a four-part series on this to begin with. We'll have more to say about this next Sunday morning, Lord willing. But for now, we want to give you the opportunity to come to Jesus and to respond to the Lord's invitation. The Lord wants us to be right with him in every area of our lives, not just our clothing. We need to be respectable people, but more than that, we need to be forgiven people. And if you've not been forgiven of your sins, then that's something that you need to address. The Lord says that if you will believe in Jesus, repent, and turn away from your sins, confess that Jesus is your Lord and Master, and if you will be baptized, then your sins will be forgiven. You can start your walk with him. You are required from that point on to follow Jesus carefully and obediently until the day you die. If you're ready to be baptized, or you're a Christian that needs to repent of sin in your life, maybe it has something to do with the clothing that you wear, with doing something that's not respectable or that reveals too much, we would be willing and happy to pray with you and for you and ask God for forgiveness on your behalf. But whatever your need is, come now and let us know.